"Are you okay?" "I'm okay," she says, but her eyes tell a different story. This is not the story of fame, not the highlight reel we saw on TV. This is the story of what got lost in the spotlight. Jazz Jennings, once celebrated as a trailblazer, the youngest face of transgender identity in America, grew up not just as a person, but as a symbol of progress, a beacon of hope, a movement in motion. But what happens when a child becomes the face of that movement before they even know who they are? This is a story we need to revisit. Not to attack, not to dismiss, but to understand. Jazz Jennings burst into the public consciousness at just 6 years old. Her bright eyes, confident voice, and undeniable authenticity made her a sensation. She was different, and she knew it. She said it out loud. "I'm a girl." And millions listened, applauded, some recoiled, others cried. And suddenly, this little girl became a lightning rod in one of the most divisive cultural conversations of our time. From talk show appearances to her own reality TV series, Jazz wasn't just telling her story, she was living it out loud. Every detail documented, every choice scrutinized. She was smart, charming, articulate. She was also a child under constant surveillance, a child praised for her strength while quietly struggling to understand who she was becoming. As she transitioned physically, the world transitioned around her. Medical professionals, advocacy groups, politicians all had something to say. Jazz Jennings was no longer a person. She was a case study, a headline, a cause. But under all that applause was a quiet sense of isolation, confusion, and emotional wear that few were willing to acknowledge. Until now, because this story isn't just about gender, it's about identity. It's about pressure. It's about what we project onto children when we're desperate for hope. So, ask yourself, can anyone, especially a child, truly thrive under that weight? We're not here to answer for Jazz. We're here to listen to the silences, the doubts, the questions no one wanted to ask. This is the story of Jazz Jennings. But it's also the story of what we missed while we were watching. It started, like many childhood stories do, with a simple sentence. "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl." Jazz Jennings was just 2 years old when she began asserting her gender identity. Her parents, Greg and Jeanette, were caught off guard. At first, they assumed it was a phase, a quirky insistence of a toddler still learning the world. But the conviction didn't fade. It intensified. By the age of 5. Jazz's social transition was complete. She wore girls' clothing, used she/her pronouns, and answered to her chosen name. Her parents had made a decision few families at the time had faced, to affirm their child's identity publicly and fully. It was 2005, and conversations about transgender youth were rare, often tinged with stigma and misunderstanding. But the Jennings family didn't hide. They stepped into the light. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 2007, 6-year-old Jazz appeared on ABC's 2020th in a groundbreaking interview with Barbara Walters. It was the first time many Americans had ever seen a transgender child, let alone one speaking with clarity, confidence, and warmth. Walters seemed visibly moved, unsure whether to treat Jazz as a child or as a symbol. The segment was a cultural earthquake. Overnight, Jazz became the most visible transgender child in the country. The response was immediate and polarized. Some hailed the Jennings family as pioneers, champions of compassion and courage. Others accused them of child abuse, claiming they were forcing an identity on Jazz too early. Medical experts, politicians, and internet commentators all chimed in. Jazz was no longer just a child. She was a battleground, but to many watching, she was also inspiring. Her poise, her smile, her honesty, all felt real. In a world starving for clarity on gender identity, Jazz offered what looked like certainty. She knew who she was, and her family stood by her. In the years that followed, her visibility only grew. Jazz became a public speaker, an author of a children's book, and a frequent guest on national television. Then came I Am Jazz, the TLC reality show that would follow her through adolescence. Cameras tracked her daily life: school, friends, doctor visits, therapy, awkward moments, joyful milestones. But while Jazz seemed to thrive, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. She was learning to smile on cue, to explain herself again and again to curious adults, to present not just as a girl but as the right kind of girl, a brave girl, a role model, a success story. She was growing up, yes, but under a microscope. As the applause grew louder, so did the expectations. She wasn't allowed to falter. Every word, every outfit, every decision carried meaning. Jazz wasn't just living as a transgender teen, she was defining what that meant for millions of people watching. Her rise was meteoric, her influence undeniable. But beneath the fame, the Jennings family was beginning to wrestle with a question they hadn't asked at the start. What happens when the world needs your child to be perfect? As Jazz Jennings' fame expanded, her story evolved from being personal to political. The bubbly, confident girl America met on television was no longer just a kid living her truth. She had become a movement. Jazz wasn't just representing herself, she was representing an entire identity, a new kind of childhood, and an evolving cultural battleground. And with that symbolic weight came a level of responsibility no child should ever have to bear. The TLC series, I Am Jazz, was a huge step into the public eye. Cameras followed her to doctor appointments, therapy sessions, school meetings, even intimate family moments. No topic was off limits. Viewers watched as Jazz navigated friendships, school dances, bullying, hormone treatments, and more. It was raw, emotional, and at times, deeply personal. But it wasn't just a documentary, it was a production. Jazz's mother, Jennings, became a powerful figure behind the scenes. She scheduled interviews, negotiated contracts, and steered the public narrative. She was Jazz's fiercest advocate, her protector and, increasingly, her director. Too many. Jeanette was the model of modern parenting, courageous, progressive, devoted. But to others, especially those watching more closely, the dynamic raised uncomfortable questions. Was this unfiltered supporter, carefully curated messaging? Support is quiet, unconditional, often invisible, but orchestration is louder. It requires control, coordination, and sometimes sacrifice. In Jazz's life, her identity, her body, her voice became part of that coordination. Each season of I Am Jazz brought new milestones, new medical decisions, and new public reactions. Jazz, once carefree and outspoken, began showing signs of emotional fatigue. Her voice grew softer, her expressions more forced. The moments when she didn't know what to say. Edited out, the moments she cried. Highlighted. She was now a brand, a carefully balanced equation of vulnerability and strength. Viewers needed her to be inspirational, but also relatable. Strong, but still struggling. A fighter, but never angry. As the seasons went on, this performance of identity grew heavier. Jazz had to smile through invasive procedures. She had to explain decisions she might not have fully understood. She had to show bravery even when she felt broken. In one revealing episode, Jazz quietly recorded a video journal, whispering through tears, "I feel like I'm living a lie." It wasn't a line meant for the cameras. It was a confession, one that seemed to slip past the layers of production. That moment, brief and almost lost in a sea of footage, exposed something deeper, a fracture in the narrative. Jazz's journey had always been framed as progress, as proof that early affirmation could lead to wholeness. But what if wholeness wasn't so linear? What if affirming one truth meant silencing another? As her adolescence continued, Jazz was boxed into the role of the successful trans teen. It wasn't a title she chose, but it was one she had to maintain. The public adored her. Schools invited her. Politicians cited her. Activists championed her, but none of them saw the private costs. The growing anxiety, the sense that her story no longer belonged to her, that she wasn't allowed to be confused, or angry, or unsure. She wasn't allowed to just be a teenager. In truth, Jazz Jennings was not just a symbol, she was a human being, trying to evolve in real time while the world watched, and the bigger her platform became, the more distant she became from the simple, quiet voice that started it all. I'm a girl. That truth had been buried under layers of expectation, validation, and pressure. And slowly, painfully, it was becoming harder to hear her say it at all. As Jazz entered adolescence, her journey took a turn that would spark even more public debate and raise questions that continued to divide experts, families, and entire nations. At just 11 years old, Jazz began taking puberty blockers. These medications paused the natural development of male secondary sex characteristics, facial hair, voice deepening, genital growth. For Jazz, and many in the medical and advocacy communities, this was framed as compassionate care, a way to prevent trauma, to keep her body aligned with her identity. But that decision wasn't without controversy. Critics immediately questioned whether a child could truly consent to such a path. Could Jazz, so young, so deeply immersed in public affirmation, the permanent implications of halting her biological development? The Jennings family said yes, their doctors agreed, and the blockers were only the beginning. Not long after, Jazz began taking estrogen cross-sex hormones designed to feminize her body. By age 14, she looked and sounded like a cisgender girl. Her voice never deepened. Her frame remained slight. The blockers had done their job. So had the hormones. On the outside, everything seemed aligned. But inside, doubts began to surface. In video diaries and off-camera moments, Jazz started expressing a different kind of pain, not physical, but existential. "I don't feel like me," she said softly in one clip. The sentence passed quickly in the show's edit. But to anyone really listening, it was chilling. This wasn't a teenager struggling with being trans. It was a teenager struggling with being herself. Period. Puberty is not just a physical process. It's cognitive, emotional. It's a time when young people develop a sense of self, of boundaries, of who they are separate from the world around them. Jazz skipped that dot by stopping her puberty. Had well-meaning adults also stopped her natural, emotional growth? That's the question psychologists began to ask. Because what was missing from Jazz's life wasn't just testosterone. It was time, privacy, the freedom to question, to make mistakes, to change her mind. Jazz had no space to explore identity in private. Every step of her development had been public, praised, and packaged as progress. The show, the speeches, the accolades, they all told her she was doing great. But in her quiet moments, Jazz began revealing a different truth. I feel broken. That's not just sadness. That's a fracture in identity. And it leads to a bigger question society still wrestles with. How early is too early? At what point does intervention stop being supportive on, start becoming irreversible? Supporters of early medical transition argue that delaying care can lead to severe distress, depression, and even suicide. To them, Jazz's smooth outward transformation was proof that early intervention works. But others point to her emotional journal entries, her mounting anxiety, and the psychological fallout as evidence that something vital was lost in the rush to affirm. Neither side denies Jazz's identity. What they debate is how to handle it, how to balance affirmation with caution, and whether children, especially those in the public eye, can truly give informed consent. Because Jazz's life wasn't just shaped by medicine. It was shaped by cameras, contracts, and causes. She wasn't just navigating gender. She was navigating all of that under pressure. And as the decisions piled up, blockers, hormones, surgeries, there was less and less room for uncertainty. Jazz wasn't just living a transition. She was living a timeline. And timelines don't wait. At age 17, Jazz Jennings reached what many considered the final step of her transition gender confirmation surgery. It was framed as a personal milestone and a historic achievement. She would become one of the youngest individuals in the U.S. to undergo the procedure. For her supporters, it was the triumphant end to a journey she began at 2 years old. But the celebration didn't last long. The surgery, intended to construct a neovagina using existing genital tissue, hit an unexpected barrier. Because Jazz had been on puberty blockers from such an early age, she had not developed enough penile tissue for the procedure. Her doctors were forced to improvise using skin grafts from her stomach and other areas of her body to complete the operation. This anatomical consequence wasn't discussed publicly beforehand. It wasn't part of the affirmation narrative, but now it was front and center. The very medical interventions that helped shape Jazz's identity had also created surgical complications no one had fully prepared for. Within days of the operation, Jazz developed intense inflammation and began experiencing severe pain. Her recovery was far from straightforward. Follow-up procedures became necessary, first to address structural issues, then to treat infections, and later to make further adjustments to the knee. What was supposed to be a one-time operation turned into a series of medical events, and each one carried a toll. Jazz began speaking candidly about the experience. "I've had a lot of surgeries," she said, "and I've had a lot of complications." She wasn't smiling. Her voice was flat, her expression blank. It was one of the first times the public saw her without the signature optimism. The physical pain was real, but so was something deeper, and emotional numbness creeping in. "I feel disassociated," she admitted in a confessional. "I feel kind of broken." These weren't the sound bites of a proud trailblazer. They were the quiet echoes of a young woman grappling with what had been done to her body, and why. The show didn't shy away from these moments, but it also didn't dwell on them. There was always a return to optimism, to the polished message of affirmation. Yet viewers could see it. Jazz was fading. Not her identity, but her energy, her connection to herself. Her story, once hailed as a success model, was revealing another layer, a warning. Because while gender-affirming surgery can be life-saving for some, it also carries profound risks, especially when performed at a young age. Under public scrutiny, and in the absence of long-term data, Jazz had been praised for her courage, applauded for her maturity. But maturity is not immunity, and surgery is not a resolution. What had been marketed as the culmination of her journey, the ultimate affirmation, was now a source of new trauma, not just scars on her body, but on her psyche. She no longer wanted to talk about identity. She wanted to talk about healing, not celebration. Survival. Jazz had followed every step the world had encouraged. She'd affirmed, transitioned, advocated, inspired. But now she was in pain, and very few people knew what to do with that. The surgery didn't break Jazz, but it did reveal something uncomfortable, that even with the best intentions, medical progress and family support, things can go wrong. And when they do, the consequences don't just hurt, they echo through the body, through the mind, through the spirit. This wasn't the ending anyone expected, but maybe it wasn't the end at all. It was the beginning of something far more honest. After the surgeries, something in Jazz Jennings began to dim. Her presence on social media became less frequent. Her once bright smile started to fade. When she did appear, she seemed different, heavier, quieter, more distant. The vibrant teenager, who once radiated energy and charm, had begun to disappear behind the weight of something she couldn't name. By her early 20s, Jazz revealed she had gained over 100 pounds. What began as physical recovery turned into emotional collapse. She described episodes of binge eating entire pizzas, boxes of donuts, thousands of calories consumed not out of hunger, but desperation. "I'm spiraling," she said, on I Am Jazz. "Food is my coping mechanism." It wasn't just about food, it was about everything. The pressure, the spotlight, the never-ending expectation to be strong, composed, and inspirational. The burden of being the perfect trans kid had taken its toll. And now, for the first time, she was unraveling. Depression crept in. So did anxiety. Jazz struggled with everyday tasks, getting out of bed, brushing her teeth, showing up to therapy. Despite the support of her parents, especially her mother Jeanette, she felt trapped in her own life. In one particularly painful scene, Jeanette pleads with her daughter. "You're just saying stuff and it doesn't make sense. I just want you to love yourself. Why is that so hard?" Jazz doesn't respond. Her eyes are distant, her expression blank. It was a haunting moment, not just for what was said, but for what wasn't. The silence between mother and daughter spoke volumes. It wasn't just a family disagreement, it was a symbol of how far apart they had drifted, emotionally and mentally. The reality was unavoidable. Jazz wasn't okay, and she hadn't been for a while. The same girl who once stood on stages and gave speeches now needed to pause her life. She had been accepted to Harvard University, an incredible achievement, but delayed enrollment. Her reason was simple and devastating: "I need time to heal." For years, Jazz had been held up as an example of what was possible with love, medical care, and affirmation. But now, she was admitting that all of it hadn't been enough. That despite the applause, she was in pain. And in doing so, she shattered the myth that transition is a straight line from confusion to clarity. The myth that early intervention guarantees happiness. The myth that visibility alone is healing. Jazz didn't just need space, she needed to reclaim her story, to stop being a symbol and start being a person again. But even that proved difficult. By now, her life wasn't just her own. It belonged to millions. 2 TV contracts, advocacy groups, school curriculums, political debates. Jazz had become an idea, something people pointed to in arguments, whether in support or opposition. But behind that idea was a young woman struggling to survive. And this wasn't a rare moment of burnout. It was a reckoning. She'd lived nearly her entire life under the gaze of a public that wanted her to be something specific, something strong, something certain, but certainty had become exhausting on her most vulnerable moments. Jazz admitted she didn't feel attraction to anyone, not emotionally, not physically. "I don't know if I ever will," she said. Her tone was flat, her face unreadable. Unreadable. This wasn't about gender. It was about self. Who am I without the cameras, without the pressure, without the label? That's the question Jazz is still trying to answer. And maybe, in the asking, she's finally beginning to heal. To call Jennings' story tragic is too easy. It flattens something far more complex. Her life is not just a cautionary tale, nor simply an inspiring journey. It's both, and neither. It's the life of someone who was never allowed to just be. From the moment Jazz appeared on national television, she was more than a person. She was a headline, a symbol, a hope, a fight. She was the story that needed to be told again and again, but rarely on her terms. Her struggles aren't proof that being transgender is wrong. They're not proof that transition fails. They're proof that identity needs room to breathe. And Jazz never had that room. She transitioned before she knew what puberty felt like. She advocated before she knew what self-doubt felt like. She stood on stages before she had time to sit with her own questions, and the world applauded. Every step. We loved Jazz when she smiled, when she was articulate, when she made things easy to understand. But when she grew quiet, gained weight, broke down, we looked away. Or worse, used her pain to push an agenda. Some advocacy groups doubled down, insisting her struggles were the result of societal cruelty, not transition. Others began to distance themselves quietly, replacing Jazz with newer, more polished faces of trans success. Meanwhile, conservative pundits pounced. Clips of Jazz's exhaustion were stripped of context and turned into headlines. Look what they did to her. They used her not as a person, but as proof of failure, of regret, of ideological overreach. And through it all, Jazz remained stuck in the middle, pulled by both sides. Spoken for, interpreted, never truly heard. What she needed, maybe more than anything, was silence. Not the silence of repression, but the silence of peace, of privacy, of stillness. Instead, she lived with constant narrative, pressure. Every word she spoke had to be measured. Every emotion she expressed had to align with someone's cause. Her pain couldn't be just pain, it had to mean something. And that's the real failure. Not in Jazz's identity, not in her desire to live authentically, but in the way society demanded a perfect story before it. He even knew how to tell a complex one. Jazz has shown tremendous bravery, not just in transitioning, but in surviving it. In owning her setbacks and saying, "I'm not okay," even when the world desperately needed her to be. And in that honesty, she's become something even more powerful than a symbol. She's become real. Because identity isn't built in perfect arcs. It's built in mess, in doubt, in undoing, and rebuilding. Jazz's life isn't over, but it's at a turning point. She's stepping out of the narrative others built for her. She's learning what healing looks like when no one's filming. And for the first time, the story might actually be hers. Her journey reveals a bigger truth about our culture. We are deeply uncomfortable with complexity. We crave clean stories, happy endings, inspirational arcs. But real people don't live in arcs. They live in layers. Jazz is not a warning. She's a reality check. Her experience doesn't invalidate transition, it challenges the way we tell stories about it. The way we push kids into boxes labeled brave or broken before they've had a chance to grow. She was a child, then a symbol, then a case study, but now, maybe for the first time, she's just Jazz. And that, in the end, might be the most radical thing of all.